Hi everybody, as you know, I'm Kati Clemens and I'm the coordinator of Learntech Accelerator project. And now we are at year 2020 and coming to the last spring of the LEA project. And I'm very, very happy to say that our first guest for our webinar series this spring is Toby Baker from Nesta UK. So please introduce yourself a little bit and your organization. So let's start with that.
So thanks for having me on the webinar series. Very pleased to be here. So my name's Toby Baker and I work for an organization called Nesta. Nesta is a foundation, so we're a charity, and our mission is to support innovation for social good. So education is one of the key areas that we work in, but we also work across healthcare, other forms of government innovation, etc. And specifically, the focus on social good, I think, is important to remember, because typically the problems that we're drawn to have a number of quite tricky characteristics. So they're often very complicated. They often involve working within a system that might be very fragmented and might involve both the government, public sector, as well as private sector. And I know, my work is all focused on Edtech, education technology, and definitely we feel in the UK it's a hugely complicated issue to be trying to deal with, and you've got things to do with big structural decisions at the level of government. You've got decisions in private companies and their own motivations, etc., that interplay with it. And obviously, you've then got all of the realities of everyday practice in schools, colleges, universities. So it's a very complicated problem, which is why it appeals and makes it interesting to work in. And our work around education technology specifically involves Nesta working as a research organisation, and we publish research. Recently, for example, we looked at the potential of artificial intelligence in schools and colleges, which I know is a bit of a hot topic and a buzzword, but we tried to be quite grounded in what we were looking at. But we also bring money to problems. We're lucky to have an endowment which was given to us by the National Lottery in the United Kingdom 20 years ago when we were founded. So we bring a combination of research and then actually trying to test things out and give financial support and sometimes expertise and advice to organizations. That might be companies, it might be schools and colleges, it might be teachers who are actually trying to do stuff. So it's that combination of research and money that is at the heart of what we're trying to do at Nesta. And then a little bit about me. So I'm a program manager within our team here, and my time is spent working to bring together schools and colleges and education technology tools to try and help schools and colleges make more effective use of technology and data. So in practice, I spend quite a lot of time visiting schools, talking to teachers, and I also spend quite a lot of time visiting exhibition trade fairs and looking at shiny bits of technology. And I suppose the most obvious finding from spending a lot of time doing that is that there's quite a big gap, a big difference between the things that technology can sometimes do and the reality of technology in lots of schools and colleges in the UK at least, but I'm sure it's true across other bits of Europe. And so that's kind of at the heart of the problem that my work is around trying to solve. How do we close that gap between what technology can in theory do in ideal conditions and what actually happens in schools and colleges?
So let me get this straight. So if let's say that a school has some sort of problem, let's say that the problem is a societal problem that they have a lot of dropouts or their kids are bored in the school. Could you help somehow? Could you introduce some technologies for them that could help maybe? Or how does it work? How does the process work?
So our role has a few different components to it. So we invest in technology companies. Actually, we've got an investment fund, and that's where we're directly working with technology companies. But we have a stake in it. You know, we would like financial return as well as a social return. Mm-hmm. Then we also award grants. So that's money with no strings attached. For example, at the moment, we are in a partnership with the UK government. And in the last 6 months, we've announced about £1.6 million in funding that's going directly to technology companies, working on specific problems. So how that looks is we might say, as we did recently, you know, we're really interested in reducing the amount of time that teachers spend marking and doing
on exams,
managing data. Mm-hmm. We think technology can do better than humans, and we don't think it's the best use of teachers' time. So we've awarded specific amounts of money to companies that have promising tools that could support teachers in those areas. Mm-hmm. And that money is attached to specific things that they'd like to do with it. That might be to add specific functions to a product. It might be to grow their reach into more schools in England or the UK, or it might be to improve their evidence base and find out more about how those tools actually work, what are optimum conditions, etc.
So who can apply?
So anyone can apply.
I mean, is it the school or is it the company that applies the money from you?
On the fund. So that most recent one was for technology tools. So that was mainly private companies, but also some tools that were developed in universities. And one tool actually that we've awarded money to that a college themselves developed, a sort of help desk for information within the college that was developed by the college itself. So there's a few different models there.
Do you, do you require them to work together with the schools? So if you give money to the companies, do you say that you have to test in real schools, or you just give the money and don't care?
So it depends what they're doing. We definitely don't give them the money and don't care. Often companies are applying to carry out research, in which case we would have some specific criteria that we'd be looking for. It might be that you need to involve X number of schools and you need to provide them with reasonable support to engage in the process, and you need to make sure they get something good out of it. Mm. We have another program which is more directly about how do we bring together schools and technology tools, which is called the Edtech Innovation Testbed. Mm-hmm. And that is specifically about addressing two key problems. Mm-hmm. On one hand side, we want to help technology companies develop more robust evidence in support of their tools. Mm-hmm. And that's important if governments, schools, individuals are paying money for technology. You know, they deserve to know whether it's effective and whether it will be impactful for them. But it's also important for technology products themselves as they want to improve. You know, we believe that the way to improve technology tools is to be continually looking for feedback, improvement, and learning from quantifiable things that will suggest how to improve the technology products. So one issue we're trying to do is help edtech companies develop more robust evidence. And I think, you know, for us, robust means it's very common that we come across technology tools where really the only evidence they have is some positive reviews from teachers or some feedback from some students who have used it. And we would argue that we should expect more, and that we should help companies to develop more, because
What
we know
kind of evidence are you thinking that they could have on beyond that?
So right at the other end of the spectrum, so if you've got, we've identified what we think is a bit of a gap in the types of evidence that technology companies typically, there are obviously exceptions, but typically can access. In the UK, there's lots with that kind of low stakes evidence, teacher reviews, etc. And then right at the other end of the spectrum, there aren't very many of these, but right at the other end, you might see large-scale randomized control trials operating across hundreds of schools. So a randomized control trial is where you compare in a very systematic way people who receive an intervention versus those who don't, and you try to quantify, what gains have been made that wouldn't have been made otherwise. And, very supportive of large-scale RCTs. I think they're important things, but they are very expensive.
Yeah.
They can take quite a long time to do. I mean, it depends on how they're designed, but sometimes to see impact on attainment, for example, you might need a 2-year study.
Exactly.
And they're not always, as a result, they're not always very flexible to the needs of schools who might be participating in a trial, or the needs of a technology company whose product might change hugely across a 2-year cycle of an evaluation.
Yeah.
So the types of evaluation that we're trying to support through this program are kind of in between those two extremes. So we are trying to use comparison groups. We are trying to look at multiple outcome measures. So it might be things around teacher workload, but we're also interested in attainment or parental engagement, whatever it is for that particular education technology tool. But our starting point is not so much what's the purest way that we could perform this evaluation, but what's the most practical and useful way we could perform this evaluation. So if we're told by a school, there's no way that I can participate in an evaluation that's 18 months long, well, then we don't design an evaluation that's 18 months long. And so there's more room to be flexible about the types of evaluation that are available, we would argue, while still generating evidence which is useful and robust.
Yeah. So before the LEA project, most of the partners that we have now were involved in this pre-commercial procurement project called iMail, and we were designing a personalized learning environment for schools. And one of the main things behind that was also like the reducing the teachers' time on exams. So there was a lot of challenges, but that was one of them. And we also faced this same problem that we had a testing period of 1 year, but we had no actual budget for testing for the schools. So how do you get schools to participate on 1 year long experiment where they would basically have to change everything that they do, all of their daily activities, in order to get enough data, for example, for artificial intelligence to work? And of course it did not. So what we were doing was like these 2 6 weeks long periods, because that was like the maximum that we could get out of the schools without paying them. And that's unfortunately then the evidence is not that robust, and I think that this is a big challenge. This is a big problem. However, what I have seen since then, that since we ended the iMail project, that some of the products that we were testing back then, they have now gone into the schools, and schools have started using them in their daily activities. And I visited one of those schools this December, like 1.5 years after, and they have now started using it like in their daily lives. They have completely changed everything that they do in mathematics, for example. Or no, it's not in every topic, and it's not in every teacher. Maybe they have 5 mathematics teachers and one of them is using it, but you could see that it was spreading in the school. So there is clearly some sort of initial steps going forwards. But how do you get the schools motivated unless you pay them to do that? Do you have some sort of idea on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have ideas. Time will tell how effective they are. We're at the fairly early stages of this testbed program. I think there's 2 particular issues which we've picked up on from speaking to schools involved in the program that we have tried to leverage as kind of ways to keep schools and colleges engaged. So the first is that lots of staff in schools and colleges told us that professional development, so some form of training, was a hugely valuable thing. And obviously, it costs money to provide professional development, but for lots of people that will feel easier to do than just give schools some cash, which might disappear into their budget and be spent on anything else. So prioritizing professional development is something that we've done and has been quite popular, it seems. Do
you partner with universities and give them diplomas, or how do you,
So we have partnered with a university to help us design and deliver the evaluations. And the professional development aspects of the testbed are a combination of, they're mainly through events, which are part of the agenda will be sort of teachers comparing their experience with other teachers who've gone through exactly the same process as them. And I think we shouldn't underestimate how important that is and how teachers really like that. Teachers can speak to their immediate colleagues in their own school quite often, and sometimes they can speak to teachers in other schools, but being part of a group of, say, 20 people in a room, and you've all gone through exactly the same experience over the last 6 months, but in different ways, is quite an unusual opportunity. So part of the day we've just looked at as how do we get those teachers to share their experiences with each other as a learning exercise in and of itself. And then we are working with an external partner, or we will be working with an external partner to deliver a more formal bit of training through the workshop. Interestingly, we've opted not to focus on training about any specific technology tool, because we're hoping, through the program, schools will be trialing one specific tool, and that, they should get training on how to do that from the technology company themselves. But we know that when we're thinking about evaluation and the impact of technology products, the sort of the when and the how and the who is just as important as the what technology tool did you use. And all of those questions about context and wider strategies in schools are really, really interesting. So we're trying to go into that within our evaluations, but we're also prioritizing that through the professional development. So we've chosen to focus on wider Edtech strategies in schools as sort of common core to the professional development piece. That so far schools and colleges seem to have been really interested by. And for a lot of the schools who are taking part in these evaluations, we have to understand why they want to be involved. And their reasons are not identical, but there's probably 2 or 3 quite common reasons. So the first is, they just love technology. They're one of those really innovative schools, or they've got 2 or 3 members of staff who are really passionate about technology. And that's fine. I think, great. We're always going to attract people like that to a program like this. But then the second reason that's come up quite a bit is that schools have sort of decided to prioritize technology in the near future. You know, their school strategy has a line in it about technology, but they're not sure what to do and they don't know where to start. So for quite a lot of the schools and colleges involved in the testbed program, they are what I would describe as sort of interested, but a little bit skeptical. And I think that's quite a rich group for us to work with. You know, it's more realistic than working with just those schools who are already fantastic at this stuff, already have millions of iPads and know exactly what they're doing.
Have you used, sorry,
a little bit the experience to the type of things that schools and colleges want to get out of participating in the wider evaluation program.
So are you actually then putting together those advanced schools and the ones that need a little bit of mentoring? So are you using as a kind of like mentoring program from those schools that are more advanced towards those that are still kind of skeptical?
So mentoring program is probably a bit grand to describe it, but we are trying to, at the very least, get them in a room together and start having conversations. I think we are really open to seeing what we can do on top of that. And I think testing what is useful and what is less useful, and will be driven slightly by how the next 6 months go. So I should explain that we're relatively early on in this program. So the structure of it works that we had schools and colleges applied to take part, education technology tools applied to take part, and we had 330 schools and colleges in England who wanted to take part and 50 edtech companies.
Wow.
Recently, we've been through the process of matching up technology tools with groups of schools and colleges who we think are a good fit for that specific tool. So that's based on things like infrastructure requirements, access to hardware, but also sort of what they have prioritized in their strategy. So some schools may be thinking, this year we're really going to focus on maths attainment for students aged 13 to 15. And that can be something, you know, we've got enough technology tools who've applied that we can bring in some of those factors into that matching process. So it's important that we're not throwing bits of tech at schools that they don't really need or want. So we're trying to make it a genuine sort of matching process. And then the evaluation is the sort of the glue that brings together the schools and colleges and the edtech companies. And the evaluations are beginning in April and will be ongoing on a rolling basis.
What would an evaluation look like in a concrete level? Do you have some like, let's say 5 teachers per school? They try with demo accounts. What happens in the evaluation?
So the evaluation, they vary slightly depending on the technology tools, and also because our sort of the starting point for this is we need to be more flexible as people who are interested in evaluation. We need to be more flexible. So a typical evaluation might involve one technology tool being used in 25 schools, and within each of those schools, suppose it's a tool which is, some of them are formative assessment tools, so they might be used just in one subject, perhaps for homework, and we would try to either randomize at the school level, so of the 25 schools, 12 will begin using it in April, and then the other 12 will begin using it, say, 1 or 2 terms later. So staggered in that way so that we get some comparison data initially, but everyone involved in the trial gets to use the technology tool ultimately. And we're able to provide some funding towards that tool being free for schools to use for up to a year. And then the evaluation itself, we're collecting, we're trying to collect data. If it's a tool focused on attainment, then we'll be looking at attainment data. If it's around parental engagement, we might survey parents before and after, across both intervention and comparison group. But we've also really prioritized context and process, because I think we feel like this is a bit of a weak spot in lots of evaluation of education technology, because we know, and it's very obvious to people who spend time in schools, how a technology tool is used varies enormously, even within one school, from one classroom to another school, never mind from one school in one part of the country to another school in another part of the country. So I hope that lots of the area where we'll get findings which are really useful to schools and colleges themselves is in some of that softer, how do I use this? What does good practice for a school that's just purchased a technology tool look like? So it's a combination of groups working together, quantitative data points, and much softer process and implementation evaluation as well.
What happens to the evidence? Who gets it?
So all the evidence will be publicly available. We, at the very least, there'll be individual reports about all of the tools that we evaluate. But we're really keen to try and do more than that, actually. So we're looking at the moment, and we're open to advice and suggestions. So if there's anyone watching this, do get in touch and give us some advice. But how can we pull out specific recommendations for schools and colleges, specific sort of these were issues raised in the evaluation for the education technology company, and this is how they're planning to respond to them, and possibly following up with those companies in the future. And there's a couple of examples of other organizations that are trying to do more engaging things with evidence that we can look to for inspiration. Because I think we want to avoid a situation where this just becomes another bunch of PDF documents on our website that actually, people don't look at.
Oh, absolutely.
There's an organization called Edtech Impact, for example, which I think has a much more engaging model for how to present evidence about EdTech than I've seen elsewhere. It's a sort of, you get a kind of speed dial rating. It's written in a way that's very accessible for schools and colleges. So there is, I think there's lots of potential to do more with findings, again, that is common across the evaluation sector. But these are things we'll have to work out a little bit as we go along.
So what we did at the end of iMail, obviously we did also the paper, PDF reports and so on. But we asked them also to do a kind of like impact stories where they were recording the testimonials, obviously, or from children, from teachers and so on. So I think that videos nowadays very effective form of getting kids involved.
Those case studies, those videos, that storytelling can help schools to understand not just what happened in a school somewhere else, but what happened in a school like theirs.
Yeah.
Because particularly in the UK, we've got a very fragmented system. We have, multiple different types of schools with different governance structures. It can be very hard for a school to know the differences between how a technology tool is used somewhere else and how it might be used there. So storytelling is one very direct way of getting at the context, the flavor, the environment, etc. How do we use evaluation to bring together schools and colleges and edtech companies? And it's something that we've called it a testbed. And we published some research last year, March last year, which looked at different models around the world of how this problem had been addressed in different education settings.
Yeah.
And it was a really interesting bit of research but I didn't write it, so I can say it's interesting without sounding arrogant. And it turns out, there are lots of efforts that we've called testbeds to try and do this in different countries around the world, but they've all adopted slightly different models. And I think that's important because we need to respond to the context we find ourselves in. So, there are some which are much more focused on how can really early stage ideas work more closely with, maybe one school or three schools, that sort of prototyping phase of their development. There are other testbed models that are a bit more about the network element that you were referring to. How do we help good practice spread between schools around technology use? And it's been a really interesting process to learn from testbed experiences of different people in different countries around the world to try and get us to a point in the UK where we've got a model which we think addresses some particular questions for the UK sector, which I'm sure would be interesting elsewhere. But I would say there's no testbed model set in stone. It's about finding the right priorities for your, Edtech ecosystem or whatever you want to call it. And for us, evaluation has been really important. And we think there are some other initiatives which are better at doing some of that prototyping and linking up with research. And we felt this was a particular gap. But that research is called Edtech Testbeds, Models for Improving Evidence. And you can find it on the Nesta website if you are interested.
Yeah, let's put that as a link to this video so that people can find that easily. Obviously, in LEA project, we have put together a kind of a startup network of LEA school labs, which were based on the 6 countries where we have procurers inside our initial set of procurers, where we then expand. And basically what we have done with the schools is look at their needs, kind of starting discussions on what kind of needs they might have that technology could solve for them. And obviously also, since we have been working together with Torino and their EduLab concept, where we can open up the schools for companies to come and test in their products. This is something that we can see repeating in other EU countries as well. So it has been quite valuable, at least for like small and medium-sized companies. So if we're looking at big companies have their own test settings. They have their own schools. They have enough money to get the evidence and to get the value and so on. So they are maybe not interested in this kind of testbed situations. But I think that LEA will be one of those hubs for small and medium-sized companies who still don't have resources enough, let's say, for research and development. And obviously we don't want them to make products in their own garages and like then throw it towards the schools without any kind of co-design or participatory design, because that's a kind of disaster waiting for happening. So I think that we all agree that it's much better if we can design together with the schools rather than in some sort of vacuum. So we get much more useful products and they actually want to use them.
Absolutely agree. And I think reflecting on the UK, sometimes that can be really difficult. I would say, technology doesn't have the best reputation in schools in England and the wider UK. I think often technology has not lived up to the promise, when it's been purchased by a school. And certainly we find when we speak to staff in schools, they are often quite skeptical, and they don't want to be let down again. They don't give
exactly.
up time. Very short on time, they're short on money, and they don't want a bad experience if they've already had a bad experience.
Absolutely, and it's difficult to convince them.
But I think the role of organisations like yours and like ours to try and reduce some of the risk around on both sides, for the schools but also for the technology companies, reducing that risk, and maybe that's through brokering relationships, sometimes it's through financial support, sometimes it's through particular expertise in what research practice is. I think the more we can do, the better, but I think it needs to be very flexibly done, because every school is different, and every technology tool is different, and sometimes a blunt instrument isn't what we need to reassure schools about the value of technology and help them to see the value of technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. I'm going to ask you one more question, because although we've already must be on the 15 to 20 minutes that I wanted this to be, but it's so interesting to hear your experiences. So I think that this is very relevant for our audience. But my question for you is that you speaking specifically from the UK point of view. What do you think are some of the key societal problems or in the schools? What is it for the next 10 years what are you tackling on? Is it only the teacher's time being short? What else?
No, it's a very good question. So I think I've mentioned the teacher time point, which I do think is very important. But we also, I think within education technology, we have a bit of a choice to make whether we want technology to just do what we already do, but do it more efficiently, more cheaply, etc., or whether we want technology to try and do things differently and open up new opportunities. And my hope is that technology will be able to do both. I think in the UK, a particular issue that's felt very strongly in schools is around accountability and the amount of information that they need to share with the regulatory bodies which oversee schools and colleges in the UK. We have a system of very high accountability, where exams, attainment results are extremely important and assessed quite regularly. That can lead to situations where anything that isn't directly focused on improving those outcome measures is less important. And there's less time and space and freedom to focus on some of those things. And I think that is being felt by the education technology sector in the UK at the moment, and some of the priorities for procurement and purchasing. And it will be interesting to see whether that remains the case in the UK, or whether there might be a move away from some of those very high stakes accountability setup. So those are two things. I think the workload one is very real. The accountability one is very real. And that decision that it feels that schools and colleges will need to make between, is the role of technology to make what we already do more efficient, or to try and do new things. I would say that we have, in some ways, the UK is unusually set up, the way that its school system operates, which open up opportunities for doing really quite cool and different things that can be very impactful. So, for example, we have a very fragmented school system, which makes things like procurement very frustrating for technology. You have to negotiate deals and contracts almost often with individual schools. So it's very time intensive. But on the flip side, head teachers and schools themselves have quite surprising amounts of autonomy
Yeah.
to run the school in the way that they would like to run it. And so what we do find is, at the moment, they are relatively isolated examples of schools doing extraordinary things, making great gains, and they've certainly tried to do things differently. And sometimes that means, they've got one-to-one devices, whereas a school next door won't have one-to-one devices. Sometimes those differences are about hardware, but often they're about the strategy and the priorities of the school that they have chosen as they're implementing education technology. So I think, there's lots of things that make EdTech in the UK very difficult. Fragmented procurement is certainly one. High stakes accountability is certainly one. And the demand on teachers' time is a big issue as we try and do anything in schools and colleges. But there's certainly room for some really exciting practice, because there is quite a lot of autonomy for individual schools to push the boundaries a little bit and see what's possible. So, I'm optimistic about the next 10 years, but we will see what happens.
Yes, indeed. Well, as a personal opinion, do you think that it would be better to have a centralized procurement, or is the UK model working well?
I think bits of the UK model are not working well at all. So we have London is what is a hub for edtech companies. We have so many edtech companies that are based here in London, but large numbers of them do not prioritize customers in the UK at all. It's international markets that are the key to their sustainability. I think it's really quite challenging to build a business just on UK schools alone, partly because the UK is relatively small, but particularly because you have to put in a huge amount of effort to build customers within the UK. Yeah. So I think there's some structural things there that are not working for EdTech. I think we are seeing some changes as well. We have in the UK a type of school called an academy, which was introduced, crikey, this is testing my historical knowledge, some time ago in the last Labour government, so before 2010. And we've seen an increase in the rate of schools turning into academies. And academies have more autonomy.
Okay.
And they can also form trusts. So they form groups of similar schools.
Yeah.
So we're seeing a little bit of a move towards some quite exciting potential of, if you've got a group of 30 schools where some of their resources are managed centrally. So they might have a central finance team or a central technology team. Yeah. Then what you begin to see is quite an exciting thing where you've got a group that it's not so large, it's not a whole region of hundreds of schools. And the schools are similar enough to have aligned aims, understanding of each other's budget, possibly close working relationships. So some kind of exciting things are happening within those groups. So it's very, very difficult. I think if you speak to an education technology company, they would say, absolutely, the system is far too fragmented. And then I think if you spoke to schools, it would depend which school you spoke to as to their opinion on it. I mean, there are some interesting initiatives that are trying to address that procurement fragmentation. Nesta incubated a company called Rocket Fund, which has recently spun out of Nesta, and you can find it if you search Rocket Fund online, and I'm sure we can include a link to this as well. But Rocket Fund is a crowdfunding platform to help schools raise money to purchase technology. And that really was a direct response to the fact that all of this purchasing needed to be done on a school-by-school basis, because that's the nature of the system that we found. But it was very hard to do that. There wasn't much advice or exposure on what tools are out there. And Rocket Fund was an attempt to try and make sense of some of that procurement and make it easier for edtech companies to kind of list themselves on a platform.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
There's interesting stuff happening, but it remains quite fragmented and difficult to get large numbers of customers for companies.
Yes, I think so. I think that we are facing that problem pretty much everywhere in Europe. I mean, Finland is, for example, such a small market that the companies are really struggling, and specifically the language issues in many of the countries, unless you are Spain or UK, then they can be very, very kind of niche, and the schools get very agitated if you give them a bad translation of something. So you really need to have kind of native speakers, and Google Translate is not, for at least in Finnish, is not yet there. So
yeah.
So European market is a lot tougher than some of the other areas that there are. Like if we are competing with China or let's say the Spanish-speaking world also. Well, it's been very, very interesting. Thank you for this little chat. I think we could go on for another hour or however much long, but I won't keep you any more, because I think that this was a good set for us. I think it will be very interesting for both companies as well as for our procurers to think a little bit, how is it in your country, how are things organized, and learn a little bit from your experiences. If they would like to hear more about Nesta, where would you send them now? Do you have some contact details? Do you have a website? I mean,
well, we have a website. It's www.nesta.org.uk.
Yeah.
And I'm happy for people to get in touch with me directly if they've got specific questions about the things I was talking about. So I don't know, I can say what my email address is, or maybe you can link it at the bottom.
Yeah, we can link it there. Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Really interesting.
Yeah.